This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and their guests only. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. And because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Welcome to Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces, a podcast devoted to changing the way eating disorders and mental illness are viewed in our society. With your hosts, Jack and Linda Mazur and Ellen Bennett. Today's guest is Sally McQuillen. Sally McQuillen LCSW CADC is a psychotherapist in private practice, specializing in addiction recovery, grief and trauma healing. An avid reader with a double major in writing and dance criticism in college, she began working in public relations and marketing prior to obtaining her master's degree in social work. Reaching for Beautiful is Sally's first book. She and her husband live on the North Shore of Chicago, where they raised their 3 children.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces, 147, Reaching for Beautiful with Sally McQuillen. Sally has written a beautiful, tender book about her precious son who struggled with addiction and her personal grief journey. After having read her book, I am looking so forward to all of us getting to know her. But first, I would like to introduce my co-host, my husband, Jack Mazur, and our dear friend and fellow advocate, Ellen Bennett.
Welcome. We are so excited to be back, and these conversations are just so wonderful, and every topic inspires me. Here we go.
Well, welcome, listeners. Thank you for being with us again today. I'm so excited with our guest today and to share her book that I read also this past weekend, and it really resonated with me in so many different ways.
Hey, everybody. Remember that this podcast is brought to you by our nonprofits, K&B for Answers and the Emilee Connection, both formed in memory of our daughters, Katie and Emilee.
So my quote to set the tone for today's podcast is, no matter how dark the night may get, your light will never burn out. And that's by Jeanette LeBlanc. Welcome, Sally McQuillen. We are so excited to have you here today. We loved your book, and we're so sorry you had to write it, but some things are just beyond our control, and it's a gift to the world. So thank you so much.
Sally, welcome. We are just so fortunate to have this conversation with you because all 4 of us have walked this path, this unique journey of the loss of a child that is like no other. Welcome.
Welcome, Sally. Thank you for agreeing to be with us today, and we're very honored.
Sally, your book is so well written, and through our journey with our daughters, it was different, but there are so many common threads woven through all mental health illnesses. I think you are incredibly brave, and I'm so sorry for the loss of your precious Chris. Can you tell us where our listeners can find you and a little about Chris when he was young and why you called him your wild child?
Well, first of all, it's just such a sincere pleasure to be with all of you. I feel like I'm wrapped in a warm, understanding hug, and this is really a special opportunity. I also feel the presence of our children in spirit here. That just no doubt in my mind. And I can be reached if anyone's interested in reaching me or ordering my book, Reaching for Beautiful. They can go to my website, www.sallymcquillen, McQuillen.com. And so that's getting that out of the way. But I would love nothing more than to tell you about my wild child who arrived in the world in an exhilarating way. And I laid my eyes on him and was immediately, I just had the biggest crush that I had. And I apologize to my husband over this. But this is that firstborn biggest crush I could ever even imagine. And he just took hold of my heart and never let go. He had me out over my skis. He was extremely active, all in the moment, purely in the moment. No thought of what would happen even a second after the one that he was in. And a light shone in him. So I love that quote. And I often, in my own healing journey, imagine him and his light sort of helping soothe me. He was sensitive and beautiful, and he was also a challenge.
He was
challenging.
A real boy's boy, right? He
was. He really was. He was so social. Really, everything about him was driven to be with his friends, and he was very open-hearted. And so, I think that even though he was only here for 21 years, he was able to make an impact on the people that he loved. And that feels really satisfying to me. That's one of the things that I'm most proud of.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, that is. Linda always says we come into this world when we're supposed to, and we leave it when we're supposed to. And all our children made an impact. They left way too soon, but they all made an impact on the world, and they still are.
I like that because it's interesting to now have my book out in the world and to be receiving some feedback from various people, and I'm just sort of deliberating over this ongoing impact of his, and really what's driving me is trying to embody his open-heartedness as I put our story out into the world. And I know that that's what he would have wanted. One of the first mediums that we talked to in hopes of communicating with Chris and sort of forging that connection that I was so desperate to find, said that he just wanted me to be able to speak the truth and help others. And so that's what I've tried to do, is at least speak my own truth and what I believe to be his.
That's perfect. Yeah. So, you bring up sometimes there's a genetic piece of the puzzle that factors into the equation when people develop an alcohol or substance use disorder. So can you speak to that and how your background as a licensed clinical social worker has helped you and your husband navigate this path that you've been on, and yet you sometimes felt, just powerless.
Oh, that powerlessness is so profound. And so genetically, my husband and I both come from lines of alcoholism. We're both in recovery from alcoholism. We were both fortunate enough to have gotten sober in our 20s. And so I remember back in the 90s, even when I was at social work school, thinking, okay, I'm learning about genetics. I'm learning about nature, nurture. I will just make a point of loving and nurturing my children to such an extent that it will offset any genetic predisposition. Well, I consulted with AI, and I have been informed that if one of your parents has any addiction, you are 4 to 6 times more likely to develop it yourself. But if both of your parents have addiction, you have an up to 8 times higher likelihood of developing addiction. So the genetics are very powerful. And of course, what we didn't know, I think, even when I first stopped drinking, was how many people, and I've learned this along the way because I've in my career, I've been, funnily enough, I was raised by an alcoholic father. I'm recovering myself. My husband is, and my children, each of whom have their own various effects of their combustible genetics. I specialize in addiction as a therapist, and so I often work with people, not just who are in recovery, but people who've been, who are loving people who are struggling with either, and there's always with addiction accompanying mental health, anxiety and depression. It's 99% of the time. And I don't think we recognized that many years ago, but people are starting to appreciate that there's sort of this genetic loading because, there's also something that lends itself to wanting to soothe yourself with substance. And that's often anxiety, depression, or then in our case, we also have a really potent attention deficit piece that comes on my husband's side. So all of that to say that genetics really impacted my parenting and sort of getting to understand and know my child and who is this? I was a pretty energetic child, but I wasn't quite like, also, I'm throwing a lot of diagnoses and labels out, which I sort of am reticent to do. But at the same time, it helps us to understand this, sort of non-compliance that I also was facing with my children. I remember when I started to be a substitute preschool teacher, when my kids had gotten older. I have 3 children. I also have a daughter, Caroline, and a son, William. And when my kids had gotten older, I went back into this preschool setting and I thought, oh my gosh, these little ones will sit on my lap and read a book and they won't be running off, 5 seconds later. And it was just a very different experience. I would tell them what to do and they would do it, and I didn't entirely have that, at least certainly not from my firstborn. And, my boys in particular. So I think that in some ways, having my, professional expertise was helpful to me. But in other ways, I was still just like anyone else, trying to figure out how to be the best parent I could to the child that I was given.
Yeah, you talk about genetics. I know Linda always says with eating disorders, and genetics loads the gun, and society pulls environment pulls the trigger.
Yeah,
that's right.
I think it's interesting what you said about anxiety and depression, 99%, because I think Linda and Jack and I, as we have walked this path, have realized that with eating disorders, it's the same.
They never stand alone. And there's always anxiety and depression. So, and sometimes substance use, alcohol use disorders. I mean, people just want to feel better. They just want to feel better. Yeah. And I think it's really nice when you talk about being a therapist and being human. And I think that human therapists who are honest about being human and share a little bit about their journeys that can be helpful are the most impactful therapists, for sure.
I hope to, I hope that is indeed, that's part of my own, it drives me, it gives me purpose to think in terms of hoping my own personal experience can help benefit others. And I just need to be taking really good care of myself. When you were talking about eating disorders, it reminded me of, I had the privilege of working at several outpatient addiction centers, one of which specialized in eating disorder treatment. And they were just beginning to look at eating disorders within sort of the context of addiction, because it's very, there's so many overlaps.
Right.
And I think, unfortunately, for those of us who might suffer with one thing, we might also have any number of other things that we're working on. And so it somewhat doesn't feel fair, does it? But this is how the world works. And we all have our various challenges.
As we all learn this together, hopefully we'll diminish the shame and stigma associated with all of these issues. In both addiction and eating disorders, relapse can be so traumatizing and terrifying for the loved ones who are watching the train go off the track, as I often like to say. Can you share your thoughts about fear and remaining present when faced with situations that can have life-threatening consequences? We all remember the terror.
Truly, there is nothing like these very high stakes illnesses. It's so interesting because I recognize that all parents are carrying so much fear and concern, and then this is a whole different level of it. You use the word terror. This is that worry on steroids, and I just don't know how any parent or loved, I'll just speak to parents, any parent who couldn't be completely consumed with fear when their children, as you said, like if they relapse, if they're suicidal, if they're just all of these things. And so this watching the train go off the track, I mean, that too is such a journey as a parent to not, and Jack used the word powerlessness before. There was so much of, I was in fight or flight, and I didn't even realize it. And part of that was probably, and I cite this in Reaching for Beautiful, sort of bringing some of my own childhood trauma into the equation. I think often whatever wounds we've had in our family of origins, they end up presenting themselves when we're raising our children. And so we have this opportunity, and I was given and continue to be given, I think, my higher power, God, really wants me to learn this one. And that is, find a way to not be consumed with fear, but somehow find a way to attempt to let it go. Now, that doesn't mean any more than with the feelings of grief or pain, we find a way to move through those. But part of what the process is first recognizing that we're in it. First sort of really, like, I don't even think I knew. I was just on autopilot, and I was, and then it manifested in my efforts to control the uncontrollable. And so a lot of this journey of trying to release fear has been about thinking in terms of what could I control? What can I control? And even when Christopher, after 3 years of being clean and sober, relapsed, that was when I was really up against it. I had all sorts of fear, and perhaps even an intuitive knowing. Now, he had 3 near-death accidents even before he passed away, and had a degree of recklessness that I don't know. I know many other people who have, frankly, that I've ever encountered. And so I had good reason. It wasn't like I was, just manufacturing this. But at the same time, when I could try to be more present with him and sort of set that aside and not be trying to rein him in so tightly, it fostered a much closer connection. And that's kind of what I want to impart to other parents who might be struggling with this now. It's sort of like, what can we control and where do we let go? Where can we possibly get help and take care of ourselves around our fear? What do we need to do to calm our nervous system?
Yeah.
Boy, that hits home, huh?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So that's beautifully said. You and your husband found a way to navigate this difficult path with Chris. You were a team. In some ways, you and your husband's backgrounds were similar. In other ways, they were very different. But you managed, and you even reversed roles sometimes when it came to parenting Chris through this. Your other children were impacted too. What would you say to other families who might be in a similar situation right now? What would you say to them? Though nobody's journeys are the same, your lived experience speaks volumes.
I think there's some universalities. I don't know if the three of you would agree, but in terms of the impact of a child's struggle on parents, it tends to be conflict inducing. It tends to bring out the worst in us. And there were times when, the sort of therapeutic terminology is triangulating. There were times when Joey was much more enabling, and there were times when I was attempting to exercise discipline, and the roles would reverse. And I think it's fairly anticipatable that happens, that one parent might be trying to exercise so much control, and the other might be sort of, for whatever the reason, a lot of it's based on whatever our history is. And then inevitably we just find ourselves in sort of extreme places. That's what these mental health struggles and addiction usually do in terms of their impact on family dynamics. There are a whole bunch of extremes that result. And so I do remember consciously trying to come together and present a united front to Christopher. And that took a lot of behind the scenes effort. And one of the things I talked about in Reaching for Beautiful was that I often felt like I couldn't get through to Chris, that, he wouldn't hear me unless I began yelling. And I'm not even a yeller, but that was sort of part of his auditory processing. And so there'd be oftentimes I'd call in Joe to have those tougher conversations. And then by virtue of that, I'd feel left out and more powerless. And my son felt like I wasn't present. So it just gets so tricky, and then my husband had concerns that if more than one of us were talking to him and trying to make sense to him, it would overwhelm him because he'd experienced that in his own childhood. So he would sort of keep me out of the loop. It was just very, and in fact, someone was asking me recently in an interview about how our grieving the loss of Christopher affected our marriage. And for some reason or another, having come through all of what we did to sort of forge our partnership and accept each other's differences and love each other through all of what we experienced while Chris was alive, it made it easier somehow when we lost him to also be able to respect each other's differences.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And so many people tell us many times marriages under circumstances like these kind of fall apart, and that we're so lucky, that we still found a way to be together. But we saw things differently from time to time and did things different ways, but we respected each other enough. And as awful as it was to have to watch a child suffer, and the loss afterwards, can't imagine still standing here if it wasn't for my husband and my son. So we're very blessed. We're very blessed.
Well, as Linda always says, if love was enough, Emilee would still be here, and that's the case with Katie and Chris too. And we just, as parents, we're there to care for them and fix everything. And some things just we learn can't be fixed.
Even though love isn't enough, it's the most important thing.
I didn't say it wasn't.
No, I know. But I always say if love was enough, she would still be here. Mm-hmm. But even though it wasn't enough, thank God we had that.
Oh, yes.
That's what I mean. So,
yes,
yeah.
Yes. And we did our best. So what have been the most helpful things that other people have done for you during your son's ups and downs and now since his passing?
When people are able to approach something that is uncomfortable, when they're able to, Brene Brown has a little, I think it was maybe 9 years ago that it came out, like a little video illustrating with cartoon characters the difference between sympathy and empathy. Mm-hmm. And so what I've really benefited from is when people are willing to be open and approach and enter into bearing witness to what I might be struggling with before and after without judgment, and without, and I think people inadvertently, just instinctively, and I'm certain that each of you have had this experience where out in the world, people are so, we're this walking representation of other parents' greatest fear. And so where they just move away from it. And for me, not to personalize that has been something I've needed to work through because I'm so sensitive that way. I think one of the most healing things in a grief journey is finding connection, and even if it's just grief, people who will, they'll just lean in for a moment and acknowledge, and then they have to, move on to their lives.
Yeah,
it's too much too much.
It really is.
People.
It really is.
And we have to understand that too. But thank God somehow community shows up. And Ellen, other than, family, was one of the first new connections that we had who embraced Jack and I, and it was powerful. And it's a very special friendship.
Well, I always say it's, this is a club that nobody wants to belong to. And, we're the only ones that really understand.
So I say Ellen is our sister from a different mister.
Oh, yes. This kind of connection, it's really beautiful.
It's a connection. It kind of transcends so many of our conversations in terms of healing and helping and recovery. One of the connections that I believe all of us have experienced is even though our children are no longer physically here, that presence, that connection that we feel is so healing and powerful because they're part of us. And they will always be. And I believe in your book you may talk about the part of your heart that's missing, that with the loss of a child, it is deep. And so as we're talking about feeling that presence, knowing we're still connected, Will you share with us a little bit about your thoughts on that? The feeling of their presence, as well as, was that possibly part of the reason for writing your book and sharing how that connection remains forever, thankfully?
You're making me think about so many things, and it was essential to my survival. And I want to be explicit about that as a parent who's lost a child who didn't know if she could continue to move through a world that had been shattered. And I experienced it as if I was free falling, as if lightning struck my heart. And so I really needed to come. I was desperate. I was yearning for years to sort of make sense of and find a means to connect to Christopher, because I didn't know initially where he'd gone. And his absence was so consuming that it took a little bit of time to get to a place, and a little bit of suspending some disbelief. I was, unlike my husband, it was another way that the two of us were very different. He had such conviction that there is a heaven, there is an afterlife. And I was kind of like, oh, I hope it's true. I don't know. Let me find ways to determine if it is. And let me see. And I feel so grateful because I'm a feeler. So it didn't take me long to be able to communicate with him in terms of just feeling his presence. There's just this intuitive sense. Even before we started this interview, I literally felt him here along with Katie and Emilee, and I literally was thinking, it was funny and maybe sounds ridiculous to somebody, but it was sort of like, oh, I bet they're so happy to be here with my son. Like, in other words, you're like, the girls always liked Christopher, so it's sort of just a silliness to it that sort of struck me. And isn't it funny to be able to access that silliness in the midst of? But that's what Chris would want. He was also extremely funny and witty, and would want me to be chuckling a bit. And so there is no question that this book, Reaching for Beautiful, is directly derived from my need to know that he is still around in spirit. And I began by writing to him. And it was an intimate sharing in journal entries of how I was feeling and how I was missing him. And literally, my first draft, nobody would ever want to read, because it was just exclusively, I miss you, I miss you, I miss you, and where are you, and how can I find you and feel you closer, And then, in writing to him, over time, in terms of, and I had this, connection is the word that you were using. I had this connection with a writing group that was a bunch of women were getting together regularly to talk about our memoirs, all of which were trauma-based, and we were connecting with one another, just as you can, and Chris's friends, who are his fraternity brothers, talk about trauma bonding, the being pulled together around the darkness into the light, and then actually going to mediums, which I thought was the wildest, wackiest thing to do, but doing just about anything to find a way to know whether his spirit could be accessed. And it turns out it really can. Yeah. It's not the same. It's not the same as having him here in physical body, but it's so sacred to me.
Yeah, as I said when I was reading the book and I was highlighting these things, and as you're speaking now, I highlighted this on page 221. It says, "Since my grief is now more integrated, its gifts are rising to meet me. I have come back home to myself stronger, with the consolidation that my son's spirit is fueling me at my core. I no longer think of him as out of reach. He inspires me to go on beyond the limits of fear toward love multiplied." And yeah, I think that's what we're all doing, honoring their life. And yeah, it was just, I really highly recommend reading this book. It's great book.
Thank you,
Heartwarming, for
Jack.
sure.
Yeah.
So when we look back into the lives of a child lost, there are always many things parents and family members would do differently, knowing what they know now. But they did not know. It's such a complex grief. You share beautifully in your book and honestly about some of the regrets you have. And I imagine some of those regrets are universal, probably a lot of them. Your honesty is healing balm and will help resonate with so many who are grieving the loss of a loved one, especially a child. What has helped you to keep moving forward?
Well, I will say, you're so right about that, Linda, that regret is indeed universal. I've seen it now so many times, too, with my clients that are suffering any loss. The inevitable response to powerlessness, which is guilt and self-blame. And I've always been very hard on myself, and this and after Chris died was no exception. I felt I had to, and that was another thing that writing was so helpful for me to do, to be able to sort of reconcile every decision I'd made, as if I had so much more power than I ever really, that's one of the things that, and we could tell it to, my daughter's about to get married, and she's already talking about having children. And, we can tell any parent before they have children of their own, not to think in terms of being all powerful, but you don't know you don't know that that's not really our job. I mean, we have, it's such a balancing act. And so it was a real process for me to let go of guilt and to literally make direct amends to Christopher, even though I knew he would never blame me for the things I blamed myself around. And he wouldn't blame me for not being there with him while he was dying, which is one of the things that was the most traumatic for me as his mother. And so to be able to survive this has required so much in the way of that process of, guilt to forgiveness and succumbing to the sadness, not fighting it, letting it kind of come when it does. And then ultimately also embodying Christopher and his spirit means giving myself permission to have moments of joy and to sort of just make that peace with this. And it takes time. I mean, I know some parents aren't able to get past the point of their guilt and self-blame, and it keeps them, or the understandable self-pity. It's really hard to. I remember times where I just felt so. I'd see people posting things on social media about when all of their children were home, and I was just crushed and felt sorry for myself. Why is it my child isn't home from college and here for the holidays? Those kinds of things, those could tear us up inside. And so I just try to make conscious decisions to choose to go return to love, which is, what Linda alluded to earlier. And Chris keeps sending me that message. The love we give and being present in love is all that matters. And keeping my heart open just when I wanted to close it has really offered so many gifts since that time.
Yeah, that's great. So, we're all, what we're doing is to help keep our wonderful children alive and keep saying their names and talk about their memories and share with our loved ones their journey, and especially if it's been a difficult one, in the hopes that it would help others. That's why Emilee wanted her story to be told, in the hopes that it would help others. What kind of feedback have you gotten from your readers?
It's been really gratifying and heartwarming, because one of the things, of course, I wanted most was to tap into Christopher's essence and have it maybe both remind people who knew him and loved him when he was here, that he is still here, and get a flavor of him again, and kind of bring that back, and capturing some of the things that he said and did. And so people have said that they feel him, even those who, there are many people in my life who never got to know him in human form. But I feel like they know him now, and that is so satisfying to me. And of course, I know that I would love to just sit and, learn more about Emilee and Katie. I mean, there's just nothing more. And so in some ways we end up deprived of that, right? It's sort of like, ask me about my son who's not here, and so that's been really, really great. And people who have said that they admire my vulnerability, and then other people who might not be very comfortable with my openness on all that I bring to bear, and I respect that and understand it. But this is who I am, and this is how I had to. I wasn't going to do anything other than. I wanted to ensure that people who are suffering in the same ways that I had feel less alone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because grief is inherently quite a lonely road.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, you're not paying me to plug these things from your book that I highlighted, but I have to read this other one, because it was when you were on the plane and you were talking to the person on the plane, and at the end they asked, so what was your son like? And you said, that was one of your biggest fears, that people would forget about Christopher and not ask about them. And you said, you hate when people die. We often stop talking about them, and Chris is very much alive to me. So I think he always will be my favorite question, and yet I struggle to find the words, and how can I possibly capture his spirit? But, in writing the book, and, at the end you said you hope people would now know Christopher after reading the book, and I do. So, yeah.
Oh, I'm so glad.
That acceptance as part of the grieving process, that there are things we can't control, and that we all have a different path here. And that is, it is part of the journey. But when we can accept that and be able to embrace the gifts, it helps us to empower ourselves to move forward and then help others. As parents, there are so many things we can control when the child struggling with a mental health illness is an adult, or we can't control. I think I misspoke there. When your child is an adult, there are so many things that we can't control. When Katie was younger, there were things that I could say, we're going to do this, and this is da-da-da, and you could manage it. As an adult, there are some barriers, but we keep loving them no matter what. And I love how this conversation keeps rolling back to love. This truly is a journey of love. And accept sometimes that it is the best we can do. And perhaps they are doing the best as well. If the worst happens, eventually letting go of guilt and finding gratitude for the beautiful gift we all had of being their mom, their dad. Like, we were chosen. We were chosen for that job. And that always carries me along this journey, just reflecting on that. Oh gosh, I can all hear it in my voice. Here I go, the little tears welling up. Hopefully, we lean into acceptance of their difficult path, because part of our journey is realizing the pain that they lived with and understanding that. But how special they were and how impactful their lives were, we honor them with all that we do and how we move forward. Thank you so much for this beautiful book, because we need to reflect. We need to know that we can get through, and hearing the stories is so important. And your strength comes through every word. Is there anything more that you'd like to add to this very important conversation?
Oh, I could go on, but I will say, I love the way you put it. You know, when our children are little, we do have more control, and it's our job to, you know, build parameters and structure and discipline and instill values and all of those good things. And then the truth, though, is you know, from the very start, I've really come to believe that they do have a path, and that they're not meant to be spared from their pain and suffering. I remember in the very beginning when Christopher was colicky, I could not, and of course he had a really loud cry that was hard to listen to. But I remember I couldn't bear it. And it sort of was the way it was and is with each of my children when they are in pain. And yet that is what life is filled with, is challenges, and all of which I think are designed to help us better appreciate the light when it comes. And so it was never my job to spare them their life experiences. And so it's so easy to, I don't know. I think there's even grief that comes about when our children are different or when they're struggling. That's a different layer of grief, isn't it? When it's sort of like, oh, this is unexpected. I didn't anticipate. I thought I'd planned for X, Y, and Z, but oh, now you're going to give me, you know. And so those are things that any parent can relate to, not even having lost a child, but just sort of discovering who their child is. And so we just need to unconditionally love them and allow them to find their way. And so much easier said than done. I'm still very much working on that with one of my living children in particular. And it's just what we're called upon to do. And I have such gratitude. We got to, Ellen, and you put it that way. It's I got to be his mother, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
You know, in the book again, you you found a bucket list that Chris had written, about what he was hoping for in his life. And that's the grief the life that was taken away from him and Katie and Emilee. They all had dreams. And I just felt so sorry that they didn't able to accomplish their dreams and live for their dreams. So, there's so many families out there like us that are afraid to come out and show their vulnerability, and because of the shame and the stigma that they failed and everything. So, these are the most powerful things that can hopefully bring changes about to, for people to come out and tell their stories.
And I think after writing our book, and I'm sure after writing your book, the people that have come forward and kind enough to write reviews and reach out and send you an email, you're a safe space now. You're a safe space to share grief, and complicated grief sometimes. So that is something that people never forget. They don't always feel as comfortable sharing maybe with people that they're close to. And, to be able to hold that space from somebody else is very cathartic, I think, probably for everyone who's privileged to do that, even though nobody would choose to be there. And, it's also so hard on siblings, what the siblings of the person lost goes through. So, it's all complex, but the more that we can talk about things and find ways to reframe things and pay it forward in some way. And for everybody that may be different. There are people who would never be able to be as vulnerable as you have been and, as we try to be. But it's everybody has to find their own way. And sometimes it's just honoring something that your child loved. Emilee had talked always about wanting to work with autistic children. And I think if it hadn't been her wish for us to share her story, I think I would be working with autistic children. So, and there's so many great causes out there, but, human connection and compassion are the most important things, and they're what get us through everything. So, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for sharing your precious time with us and for sharing this beautiful book with us. I highly recommend it. It's time to sign off here, but it's gone so quickly. So I would like to thank our loyal listeners for tuning in. We extend our gratitude to Sally McQuillen. Thank you so much, Sally. This has been truly wonderful. I'm also grateful to our former guest and best-selling author, Julie Fingrish, author of the book Stay, for connecting us. No coincidences. This has been heartwarming and absolutely wonderful. We are grateful to Rockvox Recording and Production and to our wonderful sound engineer, Scott Fitzgerald, for his exceptional production of our podcast and so much more.
Please rate, review, share, and subscribe to this podcast, Once Shattered, Picking Up the Pieces, on the platform you are listening on. And check out our YouTube channel. Learn more about Linda and Jack Mazur, the founders of the Emilee Connection, and their beautiful book, Emilee, the Story of a Girl and Her Family, Hijacked by Anorexia, available on Amazon.
And please learn more about our co-host Ellen Bennett and her wonderful nonprofit organization in the memory of her daughter Katie, KMB for Answers, and the great things that they are doing and they've done for years. The discussions we have with all our guests are so incredibly important as they emphasize the importance of mental health for every one of us. We need to raise our voices, get rid of the shame and the stigma. Thank you, listeners.
Thank you, Sally.
My pleasure.